addressing us on this. This is a part of that series on international order. Professor Paul will be talking to us on globalization, reglobalization, and deglobalization. This is an essay that he has written recently. It was a part of a. He edited it. Maybe I'll request him to say a few words on this special issue that he edited before he starts. May I now invite Ms. Shweta Madhu from the Department of International Studies, Stella Maris College, to formally introduce and welcome Professor Paul, and also introduce our network to him. Shweta, are you here with us?
Yes, sir.
Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to another interesting talk as a part of the NIAS Tuesday lecture series. On behalf of the IPRI network and all the partner institutions comprising of various departments of political science and international studies from all over South India, a special word of appreciation to Dr. Subhachandran from NIAS for his untiring and persistent efforts in keeping this network going and facilitating such exclusive interactions with experts and scholars of IR, which are immensely beneficial to all the departments who are a part of this network. I'm delighted to welcome Professor T.V. Paul of James McGill University to this evening's lecture on liberal international order, globalization, deglobalization, and reglobalization. Professor T.V. Paul is James McGill Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. In September of 2018, Professor Paul became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. In March 2019, Professor Paul took the leadership role in forming the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change. This network is aimed at promoting worldwide scholarship on this neglected subject. He's the author or editor of 21 books and nearly 85 journals or book chapters. In August of 2001, Oxford University Press published the Oxford Handbook of Peaceful Change in International Relations, with some 41 chapters by leading scholars on global, regional, and national level research on peaceful change. Professor Paul is one of the editors. Sir, we are very happy to have you here with us this evening, and we are really looking forward to an interesting and a stimulating lecture. Over to you, sir.
I guess I can speak.
Please, all the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Subha and colleagues. I have been to some of those colleges, but I think this network is a fantastic idea, and I'm so glad that you are organizing it together. I think the availability of Zoom is helping for us to connect to everyone from different corners of the world or even part of South India. So, as Subha said, this is a whole double issue of international affairs. I'm sure you get this journal, is probably not seeing properly. Maybe I put it down. I don't know. 18 papers in it, ranging from great power politics, US as a revisionist power for this Chinese American scholar, and how the world, making the world its own liberal image, made the West less liberal, merging middle powers, Europe's far right, educational projects, two international orders, China and the US, which actually is a very interesting paper for your topic. John Owen from University of Virginia, looking forward to see two orders that are merging, states and interstitial organizations, Africa, China, UN peacekeeping, liberal international trade order in an era of shifting capabilities, liberal monetary orders, crisis of institutions at WTO, global health, international mobility, knowledge production by India's own Navneeta Behera, globalization, deglobalization, and reglobalization. That's my concluding paper. So the articles are available for free downloading. OUP has decided to keep it free until November end. If you want to go to my webpage, tvpaul.com or grenpec, grenpec.com, under publications, the link is there. It's actually very good for the projects that you're working on. It's not any master plan. Basically, people debating different ideas about international order and liberal international order. So my take on this is that the liberal order is facing what you call an existential crisis, and it's only going to get worse unless liberals themselves make reforms. But my optimistic take is liberal order has faced this before. Liberal order is perhaps about 200 years old, initiated by the imperial powers or the scholars of the times, with a lot of racism in it. It was not the most pleasant philosophy idea. John Stuart Mill, or others who, and even Woodrow Wilson had a lot of racism in him, as more and more information is coming out. Because it was so tied to empires, it was considered as how to protect these colonial empires. And that's a big challenge to even today to get out of it. But why I think it is important that we need to protect the liberal order in a different fashion, not the way it is run today. That's sort of my take, because no other order can offer both freedom and prosperity. This is my take. Okay, some orders can provide you. The Chinese order can provide probably prosperity, but no freedom. But humans need both. And the liberal order has that potential. Doesn't mean it is offering it right now. It has a lot of problems, as we know what's going on. So there are three areas where the liberal order is challenged, and the three are the core mechanisms of liberal order and liberal peace. First is economic interdependence, idea that interdependent states tend to be more peaceful, tend to have a relationship that is better than non-interdependent states. The second is democracies tend to be peaceful. Democracies are the best form of government, that they can definitely become liberal democracy, not all democracy, by the way. And the third are international institutions are very important for international peace and order. And these come out of the Kantian tripod, Immanuel Kant's ideas taken over by modern liberals. Not all liberals agree with this sort of point. So the paper argues that the success of liberal order was very much because the domestic orders were successful in adapting and in the past. And this is, I think, should not be forgotten. It is not just a challenge that they can face internationally. They have to prove their domestic orders are better than the other orders. And where the Western liberal states are failing, especially United States, is in that domain. I'll come to that in a few minutes. The global level existential challenge is largely because globalization has immensely improved the economic fortunes of countries, including India and particularly China to a great extent. But not all citizens have benefited from globalization. And those who are not technically oriented, or we know in India that people who without that kind of skill sets find it very hard to get ahead. Income inequalities have substantially gone up as a result. So there is a lot of movement in democracies, established democracies, such as the United States or even some European states, right-wing movements, populist leaders, all arising with the support of a certain segment of the population that are disgruntled with the economic distributional challenges. I think this is going to get worse unless liberals improve that domestic part of their system. So I'm calling for a kind of a new welfare state. I guess Mr. Biden is trying to implement that, but with a lot of pushback. Part of it is the neoliberal agenda, that is what Reagan Thatcher period onwards, is so powerful, it has taken over because it has allowed a lot of corporations and rich people to become extremely rich and the poor to remain poor. So the neoliberalism has indeed hurt liberal order in the long run because they don't talk about distributional aspects internally. And liberalism is, to my mind, the most successful political ideologies in the modern world, consistently able to withstand challenges to its existence. Many isms have come and gone, fascism, Nazism, and communism in particular. Of course, communism is staying in places like China, Vietnam, and maybe in Kerala. But it is doing so only by those regimes incorporating liberal economic ideas in a framework of state capitalism. This is what is, people are forgetting that China is rich today because they incorporated liberal economic ideas in the state capitalism framework without making democratic changes. So they have partially adopted, and China is increasingly playing a big role in international institutions, as we know. So 200 years of liberalism essentially a story of a lot of bloodshed. This is another thing liberals forget. Non-Western states suffered the most under Western colonialism. And that is the big challenge, and liberals made some success with the Wilsonian ideas of national self-determination, only for Western countries at that point, but nationalists all over the world took it up, and then UN established 1945. So my argument is that notwithstanding all its blemishes, liberalism and its ideals have survived for more than 200 years, as the human desires for freedom and prosperity cannot easily be fulfilled in most other systems than political economic orders. The longevity of liberalism is partly attributable to its ability to adapt by incorporating many progressive ideas from models such as Fabian socialism, liberal socialism, partially supported by figures like John Stuart Mill, who argued for the establishment of worker-run enterprises alongside private ownership companies. Now, if you look at European success stories, the social democratic states are the most interesting in this respect. The Norways and the Denmarks and those kind of states that have remained liberal, but with a strong welfare state, cradle to grave welfare state. And as a result, despite all their weaknesses in facing many challenges, they still remain the hopeful models for the rest of the world because they have a lot of strengths if you look at their societal capacity to stay on, despite all the challenges they face in the economic arena. But they are vulnerable to geopolitical struggles, as we can see the rise of China is generating divisions in Europe, Russia's challenge in particular. So I go into discussing the foundational ideas of liberalism. Liberalism is not one perspective. This is a big mistake people make. Mark Zucker and Matthew discuss 6 strands of liberalism: republican, commercial, military, cognitive, sociological, institutional. The distinct aspects of modernization. It's very connected to modernity as it emerged in the European world. Then there is John Mearsheimer recently categorized a couple of categories: generic liberalism and progressive liberalism. Generic liberalism, or he calls it modus vivendi liberalism, enshrines individuals and states to have the utmost freedom so as to develop their full potential economically, socially, and politically. So this means a lot of freedom, free trade in particular, laissez-faire. State interference should be at the minimum, and it's very much connected to Adam Smith's idea of division of labor, common prosperity results from free trade among nations, etc. Progressive liberals, in contrast, believe that the state should help individuals to achieve their goals and needs. As otherwise, not all individuals will be able to develop their endowments effectively. The idea that every human being has endowments, but those endowments cannot be developed without some support. And so Progressive liberals believe that individuals have a right to equal opportunity. So social engineering by state is very important, whereas modus vivendi or generic liberals do not recognize that right and are generally skeptical about the benefit of social engineering. You see, this tension is very high in the liberal thought, whether social engineering by the state in particular is needed or not, or it's individual who will ultimately win. And many people who critics only look at that first part of the generic, especially neoliberal ideas, without looking into account the other forms of liberalism. So the original thinkers, John Locke, Montesquieu, Adam Smith, etc., were pioneers. There is a fascinating book by John Eikenberry in recent years about liberal democracy, A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism, and the Crisis of Global Order. So it's published by the Yale University Press. And then the repose or counterpoint by Mearsheimer's book is called The Great Delusion. He's the critic of liberalism. You know about this gentleman. In fact, I have an interview with Eikenberry on his book on the GrenPEC webpage. Quite interesting ideas we discuss. So Eikenberry defines liberal internationalism as a cluster of ideas on how to think about and act in the world which emerged out of the Enlightenment and the Western democratic experience. At its core are convictions about how liberal democracies and the wider world should cooperate to organize their common relations. So there are a number of critical common elements: international openness for trade and exchange, multilateralism and rules-based relations, democratic solidarity and cooperative security, progressive social purposes for both domestic and international societies. So liberal order is the dream of a universal order grounded in law, secures peace between countries and democracy inside them. And it is based on what I mentioned, the three core principles of Immanuel Kant: international institutions, constitutional democracy, economic interdependence, all which are necessary for international peace, and the attainment of what he called good life internationally. So I would add these mechanisms work only if there is a domestic component to it, which allows democracies, especially, to treat each other with a different cultural, normative, or institutional mindset. Now, all the above propositions assume that liberal states are more likely to generate prudent, democratically oriented leaders than their authoritarian counterparts. If liberal states are led by reckless leaders, we witnessed one recently who is still hanging around in the United States, they will eventually face electoral defeat, and externally, the international system will punish them with foreign policy failures. Liberal states can thus learn from mistakes and adapt as the system demands. Poorly led liberal states also squander their reputation for making what you call credible commitments, and this will affect their ability to form durable alliances with like-minded states. But the challenge is democracies, even mature ones, can produce reckless leaders and anti-liberal pathologies of both the right and the left. Some liberal leaders may also be driven by reckless ideas and drag the international order into a mode of constant crisis. They may not learn the right lessons, especially if their constituents are driven by illiberal ideas. So Donald Trump in the past have shown better, and his core supporters show one form of this pathology. But I argue that liberal leaders in the past have shown better ability to learn and adapt, though not always for the good of all humankind. Liberalism has, actually, it's a fascinating topic. The amount of warfare liberals had to fight, often they won in the past, but doesn't mean they were peaceful. They had this history of extreme violence, and it has a lot to do with the fact that they were fighting non-liberals and ideological warfare, where they become intensely ideological and polarized. So victory at any cost, the American carpet bombing or nuclear attack, all result of that pathology. Now, the globalization challenge, as you know, the Cold War ended in 91. Deepened globalization is not a new phenomenon, as we all know. The deepened globalization occurred in the economic arena, where multinational corporations adopting free trade ideas, expanding capitalist ideas on a global scale. And so intense globalization has made major success in lifting billions out of abject poverty. Now, this is a topic of big debate in the Indian circles, I know, but point is that according to World Bank estimates, some 1 billion people have risen out of extreme poverty between 1990 and 2015. Now, this progress has since slowed, in particular since the COVID crisis of March 2020 onwards. The massive upturn in global trade investment, rise of a global middle class, and introduction of many new technologies were all possible by this deepened globalization. But globalization has generated what we call rising expectations and unfulfilled aspirations on the part of those lacking the educational or technical skills required to succeed in a highly competitive economic order. So challenges to liberal claims and prescriptions of universal well-being then arose from both the radical left and the conservative extreme right. So inequality is the big challenge here, and inequality has only worsened, as we know, as a result of the pandemic. I know for India, for instance, those who came out of poverty, many of them are back to that subsistence level or even below. So the lockdowns definitely have affected low-wage service industries, and disproportionately the poor has suffered. This has made laissez-faire ideas, especially the generic liberal ideas, highly suspicious because they don't have a system, a fallback system to protect the downtrodden when the crisis comes. That's where progressive liberalism, that's welfare state liberalism, is a lot more potential, because that's the only one that can offer some cushioning role of the state that is critical for maintaining domestic order, and that is connected to international order. So populism is a direct result of distribution inequalities and happiness among certain sections of the electorate. Added to this is the racist myth among many of America's non-college educated white underclass. The system favors Black people and immigrants, and you have a combination of discontents that Donald Trump and his Republican Party exploited through the skillful use of social media. So that the whole social media actually comes out of this intense globalization era with the technology companies spreading the wing. Bangalore is one of the hubs, I know. But the problem is the same social media can be used by illiberals or those who want to attack liberalism. And people have a cognitive side to them. They tend to believe lies. If you say 3 times somebody is a liar, people tend to believe that, even without any evidence. That's how we are programmed, it seems. Now, my paper goes on to past as prelude. The great story of international relations during the past 200 years has been one of liberal victories over in turn empire, fascism, and communism. Some even argue that it was their advantageous economic, diplomatic, and military positions that enabled liberal democracies to win in their rivalries with authoritarian states. But this process, as I want to emphasize, has seen much bloodshed. Indeed, liberals have often deviated from their core principles, such as human equality and sovereign equality, and violated liberal ideas. Early liberals were also promoters of racism and colonial empires. The liberal entanglement with Western imperialism and colonialism produced deep-rooted systemic racism and excessive military interventions, and claimed justifications for both. Britain and the United States emerged as powerful states after the Napoleonic Wars and the Second World War, respectively, and both used liberal internationalist ideas to strengthen their hegemony and imperial dominance, the latter becoming more of an empire, informal empire. So this is actually a very interesting dimension of these liberal states. They want liberal hegemony which is very much a realist idea, using liberalism to support their hegemony. But internally, they claim democratic. Internationally, not for so much democracy, up to a point they will support. So Woodrow Wilson's institutional innovations after First World War, the 14 points you may recall, the most powerful one is national self-determination. And he promoted the idea of international arbitration, freedom of the seas, and system of non-discriminatory trade, etc. So there are some progressive ideas there. And but the interwar period, that's between the two world wars, there was an intense backlash against these liberal prescriptions, partly because the liberal states could not offer the defeated power, that is Germany, a respectful settlement. The Versailles Treaty was very onerous on Germany, reparations in particular. So that resulted in the creation of revisionist states in Germany, as well as the defeat of the Weimar Republic, and Japan was another great power. So the great power norm of the day was how to become more colonial and become more acquire territory, direct acquisition of territory, and the Japanese followed through. And then came the Great Depression during that period, in the 1930s in particular. And President Roosevelt, actually a savior of liberalism, this is Franklin D. Roosevelt, his ideas, especially New Deal, welfare state principles, Medicare, these allowed the liberals to distribute wealth and saved a large segment of the US population from falling into the abyss of poverty. There's a number of New Deal initiatives between 1933 and 36. Then you have National Labor Relations Act, Workers' Progressive Administration, Social Security Act, US Housing Authority and Fair Labor Standards, maximum hours and minimum wages, GI Bill of 1944, which allowed returning veterans to go to college and earn a degree, helped in the settlement assimilation of millions of ex-soldiers. Imagine those ex-soldiers were not settled. American social divisions would have been extremely dangerous. Now, I think people forget that Roosevelt's greatest contribution was at the international level, especially when you think about India's independence. His support, somewhat support of self-determination of non-European peoples. Okay, so the liberals initially were only interested in liberating the Eastern European states, part of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. So Roosevelt and his contemporaries to let go of their notions of civilization, race, and nation and rethink the nature of liberalism and modernity. The support of decolonization helped to change the world. In fact, some of the biggest changes took place as a result of decolonization. Largely peaceful, although some violence, yes. So this was actually, the United States was interested to decolonize to make sure the European empires collapse. They were, again, maybe a realist idea there. The European empires wanted to remain as colonial powers. For Roosevelt, thought that is the worst thing can happen. They wanted a new order based on independence of new states. There's also something called good neighbor policy towards Latin America that's problematic. So the US, of course, emerges as the most powerful state. Then you have the institutions that were created, Bretton Woods system, World Bank, IMF, Marshall Plan. All this history students would know. And I think the next big change takes place under Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society innovations and civil rights reforms, because after the Civil War, there were some progress, but that were taken away from the blacks in particular. And they were back to square one in terms of public service. And Woodrow Wilson was actually doing a lot of harm to the blacks. And as a result, the Princeton School recently removed his name from the Woodrow Wilson name from the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs. And but Lyndon Johnson, despite his Vietnam War credentials, was a liberal reformer. And he started the idea of great society civil rights ideas, a lot of policies, Head Start preschool program, food stamps for families facing hunger, 1964 Economic Opportunity Act, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Immigration Act, by the way, 64 Immigration Act, which has helped India in a big way, or Indians, not all India, but who migrated after the 60s immigration reforms. And original quotas were removed, 68 Civil Rights Act, again a big achievement, 65 Elementary and Secondary School Act, 65 Social Security Act and Medicaid Acts, 68 Mass Transportation Act, 68 again Fair Housing Act. So Great Society programs reduced US poverty rate from 22% of the population to 12% between 63 and 73. The European liberals also did a lot of major innovations, and they created the welfare state, as we know. So this crisis is when liberals acted. Without crisis, liberals don't necessarily do much. I think they are better in crisis management after the crisis, of course. And you have certain phenomena occurring: blind anti-communism, a lot of war. The Vietnam was the biggest, and then you have Iraq. And this Iraq war was a self-destructive choice by the Republicans, but at the same time using some liberal ideas of regime change. The Cheneys and Rumsfeld, American supremacists, Paul Wolfowitz, etc. They wanted to maintain American supremacy and hegemony, and the defeat of Saddam Hussein and in Afghanistan against Taliban, they thought would somehow preserve American hegemony. In fact, the opposite has happened. These wars, as we know, have produced really a lot of bloodshed and suffering and caused such turmoil in the Middle Eastern order today that is not helping American hegemony in any way. A 2020 study by the Watson Institute at Brown University, you can get that online. This is one institute that does some very critical analysis of this. Post 9/11 US-led wars caused some 800,000 direct war casualties, and an even larger number of indirect casualties, gave rise to 37 million war refugees, caused some 6.4 trillion, and triggered a number of ongoing challenges and violent conflicts. 6.4 trillion would have fixed all of America's infrastructure problems, the enormous amount of inequality, the homelessness, the insurance, lack of insurance, etc. The fact remains that liberal ideas and strategies offer fertile grounds for American interventionists of all hues, including the neoconservative variety. Now, the victory in the Cold War and then these neoliberal prescriptions of Reagan Thatcher generated increasing expectations of different groups. And then, of course, the social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., are generating the ideas and demands faster than ever before. And so negative norm entrepreneurs have been able to engage in contestation by projecting selectively the ills that liberal norms have unleashed. This contestation of liberal ideas is facilitated by the skillful use of social media. Liberal counterattacks have often been less than effective. So the four mechanisms that we discussed are under serious challenge. Then comes the China challenge, which I think is perhaps the biggest geopolitical challenge, because as I mentioned, the Chinese have adopted many of the techniques of liberals in their own manner. And this whole idea of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Tianxia model, all are extremely difficult to challenge directly. You need an ideational challenge and as well as other economic challenges. And the liberal states having great trouble coming up with a better model. Of course, Xi Jinping may provide that opportunity if he invades Taiwan, for instance, or makes things worse in South China Sea. Then the liberal states will gang up because they would not find that palatable. But then again, Taiwan is another story. We can say, discuss that if you want, what the impact would be. So the current order is challenged by the Chinese liberal authoritarian and very limited sense by Russia, but I think the Russian part is not as strong as people think. And Russia needs status recognition. It didn't get that when the Cold War ended. Gorbachev gave almost all concessions, expecting reciprocity. The Western countries just didn't give reciprocity. And as a result, the Russians are disgruntled not because of major geopolitical reasons alone, but because of their treatment by the Western countries. They thought they were not giving up Cold War out of generosity, but expecting certain deals, and that were not protected. So let me conclude by arguing that reglobalization with internal reforms, without globalization, there is not much future for liberal order. Reason being, prosperity depends on international trade. Liberal technological advancement, liberal economic advance, liberal, all these things require internationalization, globalization. But when the word globalization has a bad connotation, deglobalization is happening. And so I think you need to take care of this disgruntled population. Meaningful internal reform is not unrelated to international adaptation and reforms to global governance. And so we need to think of how to promote civic nationalism as opposed to identity-based ethnic nationalism that's coming out, which also requires a liberal push. Liberalism is one that is promoters of civic nationalism. Liberals ought to give international development high priority, along with free trade and technological advancement of their own and developing countries, which they need to attract democratic partners. They also need the workforce. They don't have the demographic advantage. That's one thing that I forgot to mention. Liberal states are not producing enough kids. So they need the migrants, but they need to incorporate that powerful economic engine that they have been. So internationally, liberal ideas can offer the possibility of changes in global governance structures by accommodating rising powers peacefully. So how do we get these rising powers a better position? And that is where reglobalization is needed. Liberal states have been the wealthiest ones for over 200 years, partly helped by their colonial and imperial exploitations. They cannot remain wealthy forever. Without technological advancement and additional markets and followers, there is a tendency among countries to bandwagon with the most powerful economies. If China becomes the most powerful economies, I bet countries, smaller states will bandwagon with China, which is where liberal states need to reglobalize to prevent that bandwagoning occurring in East Asia in particular. So the three areas where liberal states really need to promote: economic interdependence, free trade, democracy promotion, and strengthening of international institutions, rules, norms, and principles. I would add a fourth element, that is reinvigoration of the domestic capacities of liberal states and their allies by promoting strategies for fair distribution of income, amelioration of class and racial divisions, and the skill development of lower income populations to allow marginalized communities to benefit from liberal economic progress. So I go on to discussing the three areas: economic interdependence, democracy promotion without violence. This is a big problem. These interventionary wars did not help, as I mentioned. Democracy promotion also entails liberals becoming themselves champions of democracy and defeating illiberal populists who do not believe in democratic ideals. Liberal democracy is the biggest target of illiberal, and authoritarian regimes that wish to base political authority on the basis of absolutist ideas upheld by ruling groups. Why did I end this?
Thank you.
I have to stop.
Yeah, we thank you, Paul. Thank you for that wonderful note. In the last few lectures, Professor Paul, we had experts from the security domain and from the diplomatic domain talking to us on the emerging world order, more from a statecraft perspective and more from a security perspective. Your lecture today brought us the liberal aspects of the world order, and more importantly, as an academic, as a scholar, as a teacher, you brought a lot of theory into the discussion. I think that's a very welcoming input for us. I'm sure all the faculty here, all the departments and the partners would agree. This is an important element that Professor Paul has got to us in discussing the emerging world order from a liberal globalization perspective. Thank you, Professor Paul, for that wonderful note. You showed us the journal. Thanks to the generosity of the journal, we could download at least for a few days. I would also forward those links to our fellow folks, scholars, and the teachers. Perhaps if you think it would be useful, sometime later we can have a larger discussion with some of your authors. Some of the essays are extremely mind-boggling to have a fresh set of discussion. We'll be very happy if you could.
By the way, the Chatham House is conducting separate discussions. As two of them already finished, another couple of them. You go to the webpage, Chatham House. That's the International Affairs.
Sure. No, why don't you give us that opportunity? We will also have a discussion with your authors on this. Sometime whenever you are free, we could do that, Paul. Yeah. Thank you again, not only for the lecture, but also introducing the work that you have done together. Now, let me open the floor. Here is Professor Paul with us with that wonderful note to emerging world order from a liberal globalization pivot. The floor is yours. Who would like to go first? Kindly raise your hand or leave a note in your Harini, please. We'll start with you. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. I thought I will just bring in because we're looking at an emerging order, I thought I'll bring in the social media and the mass information aspect of the world and try and look at the liberal order through that. So here I was thinking about how there are large groups, large industries like Facebook and Google who play a major role in data management. And so they have the access to promote one version or one kind of idea of what liberalism is, or one kind of idea of what the American version or the Western version of what liberal ideas are. So how do we place this in the growing in the emerging world order or in the future?
Thank you. Thank you, Harni. The question is well received. Professor Paul?
I think your description that it's an American version, not really. This is their private pocketbook version. Many, if you read the New York Times, there's so much debate going on how to control them. And the US Congress is actually debating the policies of these. Facebook was recently grilled. So I wouldn't call it the American version. It's a version that they're promoting because they realize that is a big moneymaker. So they're hurting liberal democracy. They're hurting freedom of expression. They're doing a lot of negative things. And there is a growing realization. But the problem is there is a competing idea of freedom of opinion. And so how can you control that? So these two are competing. But my sense is there will be more regulation in the months to come because there's a strong realization, especially the Biden team, that they are going to be on the victim side if they don't control this, because Trump is using it quite effectively. So yeah, I wouldn't call it, but it is an effect of globalization, of information revolution that took place. We need international cooperation and better regulatory mechanisms without hurting freedom of expression. And I think it's a big challenge because nobody was prepared for this massive onslaught of social media. So we had to be careful when you call it an American way, but there's some companies, yes, using that window for their pocketbook reasons.
Thank you, Paul. Next, I'll request Dr. Madhumati Deshpande. She heads the Department of International Studies in Christ University. She is one of our partners. Madhumati, please.
Thank you, Dr. Subha. I'm sorry, I'm not able to turn on my video. I'm trying from that time, it's somehow. Okay, thank you, Dr. Paul, for the wonderful lecture. As I was listening to your description of how liberal order emerges throughout this last century, one can easily notice that there are periods when liberal thought process, liberal values go down, and then another period when it comes up again. So mostly look like a cyclical order. But there is one point wherein you said the welfare democracy or the welfare liberal part is now the one that is going to help rebuild the liberal order. But how is it different now from the time that socialism actually influenced the liberal values? Like in the earlier, maybe the late 18th century or early 19th century, when socialism was actually influencing liberalism and we were getting these welfare schemes coming up. How is that different from what is happening today? They are similar problems?
I think the biggest challenge came from not just socialism alone, but communism.
Yes.
The Marxist ideas. So what the liberal states faced was workers united in many parts of the world, including led by geopolitical rival Russia and the Soviet Union, of course, later on, and then China and all. So the European states were trying to escape from communism. If they didn't create welfare state, many Western European states would have become communist. And so this was their idea of incorporating some of these ideas, but not directly from communist states, but clearly the Fabian socialist ideas that Nehru, by the way, was very influenced by. And then creating that room for welfare state to emerge. And the European Economic Community, later on EU, actually big promoters of Germany and others, because they realized that without that economic component, welfare component, these states are very vulnerable in the post-war period to communism. And so the geopolitical conflict was a big precursor, a big part of that transformation. Today's geopolitical challenge is not communism per se, state capitalism of the Chinese or other models, and internal enemies of liberalism. That is what I was trying to emphasize. So the enemies are not as powerful, but different kind of enemies. Some are very internal, caused by liberal reform, liberal policies and liberalization and the neoliberal agenda. So I think that change has to be understood. And I'm not calling for a 100% adaptation, use of welfare state, but it may have to be a tailored one. And it may have to also to include a lot of public education. And that's where the social media question is very important. How to prevent the social media from undercutting these sort of structures. So I do think that this is not exactly a cyclical phenomenon, but clearly cyclical in the sense liberalism will never be the same as it progresses. New forms of social challenges emerge, and that has to be understood and appreciated. And adaptation with change requires a lot of creative thinking. And the big question is whether liberal states have the capacity to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I saw Professor Rahul Tripathi raising his hand. Rahul, go ahead, please.
Yes, thanks, Subha. That was a wonderful presentation, Professor Paul. I'm sorry I got disconnected for around 15 minutes. So I don't know whether this point was during this time. Much of what you mentioned emphasized on the importance of the changes that need to be there as far as the orientation of the state is concerned from within. Do you feel that the kind of scenario that we are witnessing now, regionalism or multilateralism, will also have to figure in because we are already talking about multilateralism in decline, the kind of confidence regional institutions used to inspire much less. So in your scheme of reglobalization, where would regionalism and multilateralism stand? Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul.
So when I talked about institutional strengthening, that they definitely incorporate these two elements that you are mentioning. In fact, the regional institutions do offer a lot of role. Previous work of mine talk about soft balancing, restraining unlimited use of force or threatening behavior up to a point. But there is a danger of these institutions being hijacked by geopolitical actors with their interest to promote their goals. There is a parallel element going on. Regional free trade in Asia Pacific in particular is in fact strengthened to some extent as a result of regional initiatives. So it is not in the hands of the hegemonic power, United States often, because the US opposed all of them. I think the regional states themselves have to take leadership role. Why do we need to go to Washington all the time? Why don't India, for instance, should play a bigger role in the regional architecture? There is a tendency to ignore the region because the region is not very friendly often, I guess, for various reasons. But I think the region has great potential in terms of at least economic cooperation. There are fascinating growth models. Bangladesh is now emerging as a story for South Asia to showcase how a poor country can be changed. And so there may be ideas within the region that really need to be considered as important. Multilateralism, yes, the problem also in liberal states try to create their own narrow coalitions, democracies, willing democratic partners alone. And that will become definitely a precursor to a Cold War of a different form. But how do we bring in China, which is actually the big question mark? I think Xi Jinping is very ambitious. Unfortunately, his time came. His plan is to do something to unite all his territories that he thinks lost to imperialism. That include Taiwan, include parts of India's northeast and northwest. And so all these are really the geopolitical goals are contesting with these other elements of global ideas. And so we have witnessed the history is a history of this geopolitical ambitions fighting along with these ideas that people propagate. So there will be that element. And so it is not an easy one, but it's also useful to think about certain amount of leadership has to emerge from these regional states themselves.
Thank you, Paul. I see there are a few notes in the chat box. I'll invite Ramya first, Sandeep Ghoshal next, and then Ankit in that order. Ramya, would you like to go first?
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Just pleasure listening to Dr. Paul. Professor, my question is about the economic disparities that are growing in the liberal nations such as India, for example. We are producing more and more billionaires. At the same time, we are also having the most backward or the most have-nots in the society. So how to achieve such a balance? Are there any liberal societies or nations that we have to look into as role model and follow? Is there any suggestions from your side, sir?
Well, obviously, you are absolutely right. India is an example of certain kind of liberalism, not all elements, by the way. Be careful when you say liberal. India is becoming less liberal over the years in the democratic sphere. But India's economic story shows the need for a welfare state, because India produced enormous economic growth during a short period of time, adopting many of the neoliberal ideas, but it did not do the basic part of that welfare aspect, which would have been educating the public, medical care, spending a lot more than 2% of GDP on education, 2% or less on medical care, except certain states. These are prescriptions for disaster. So look at the East Asian model, the developmental states of Korea, Taiwan. Korea was poorer than India in 1950, by the way. but they had a strategy that included developmental state idea. India's biggest challenge, let me be frank with you, is Indian bureaucracy and even the political elite are not development oriented sufficiently. They'll say they are, but they are not. They're still happy with this bureaucratic hierarchical model, which comes out partly due to cultural reasons, but borrowed from the British and then reinforced by the caste hierarchy. So how do you change that mindset? So liberalization of India produced wealth, but the state capacity in terms of the common good has not improved substantially. And when the pandemic hit, you see that really hurting the people who made that 1% progress versus the 10, 20, 30% progress. And it is going to get worse unless India adopts some of these same principles of welfare state and spend a lot more on healthcare, education, housing, infrastructure, etc. Now, the political divisions within India or economic divisions are not so easy to fulfill this condition. So democracy in India is creating this condition up to a point, but it is also the elite's notions about development. You read the literature on developmental state, it is the Korean bureaucrat, the Taiwanese bureaucrat who, with a passion to develop, engage in developmental activities, even the Japanese. So there are models out there in East Asia, Asia Pacific. Not all have been successful, or even the welfare states of Europe. But of course, we don't have to go there. Korea, Taiwan all offer to a great extent ideas. I don't think there is an absence of models there. It's a matter of how you adopt, given the local conditions may be different in Indian situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Now I'll invite Sandeep Ghoshal and then Ankit. Sandeep, go ahead. Okay, Ankit, go ahead, Ankit.
Thank you, sir. Good evening to all. So my question is that I want to take example of China, and they allege that US suffers from a Cold War mentality. So does the geopolitical dynamics stem from Cold War, or if not Cold War, Great Games? Is that Oriental tendency still there in neoliberal geopolitical ambitions or calculations? My second question is, does future belong to neoliberalism, sir?
Neoliberalism is what I'm arguing. It is not the future. It should change. Well, Orientalism is there up to a point. What do the Chinese want? Is there an answer to that? The China made the most use of globalization. Okay, people forget that. I'm not saying there is no Orientalism, but it's a good way to deflect, get away from this Chinese role. China is the biggest beneficiary and the exploiter of today's global trade regime, which was a creation of globalization and the liberal states themselves, starting with Mr. Clinton's period, allowing it to enter WTO, etc. So we can say it is racism, Orientalism, but are the Chinese treating other Asia Pacific countries nicely? Do they have Orientalism, some kind of sub-Orientalism towards India, for instance? As far as I know, they don't have any respect for India and Indians in particular, because their cultural educational system doesn't give any importance to Indian history, or the things you think are important they look down upon India, by the way, the religion onwards. Read Mao's interactions with Henry Kissinger and Nixon and all that. There's a lot of stuff coming out and exactly what they were thinking of India from Nehru's days onwards. So the claim that somehow this is Orientalism, I don't agree with that. There are Orientalist tendencies. The Western story is one of Orientalism, yes. But unless you want to make China the supremo, hegemonic power, which is what they are struggling. So if China continues this path, everybody is fond of China becoming a peaceful race because then a partner, but not this going back to territorial revisionism, violating international law and adopting selective elements of international order, international law. What they're doing in South China Sea or, all these are questionable. And so I think we in India should be careful when you follow the sort of line argument that the Xi Jinping crowd wants you to believe. They have a goal. They want to dominate the world. And that is, if only their victory will produce an non-Oriental world, I really doubt that, because they have no idea, they have no interest in keeping the other parts of the Orient equals. They want them to be subordinate, as the Tianxia model or tributary model they want to create.
Thank you. Now I'll invite Lokendra.
Thank you so much, sir. Actually, I have three questions. The first one is relating to the welfare thing. So we know that after Second World War, the welfare model that came up was being funded by neocolonialism in Asia and Africa. If we were to have welfare model again, where would we fund it from? Of course, we cannot go back to neocolonialism again. So where would the funding for it come from first? Second question is, given the havoc globalization has brought about in the world, is reglobalization even desirable for that matter? See, liberalism was very resilient against external threats like communism and so on, but maybe it not be that resilient against internal threats, something which you also referred to. So it may very well collapse. So rather than focusing on reglobalization, may it not be useful to think about an entirely new foundation to build the international system on, like something which is a complete break from liberal ideas, which I think have somehow failed developing countries. And third one would be about the big tech companies, something which Harini also raised. Now, a big crisis for liberalism today is that it is confused how to deal with big tech companies. On the one hand, liberals have actively promoted these companies for decades because these companies spread further the liberal values, and also they were driver of globalization. On the other hand, they have now eventually become monopolies. They are literally overshadowing governments, even the United States, and they're collecting data at massive scales with little to no concern for privacy. So it's actually a very difficult situation to be in. I would like to know a comment on that.
Sure.
Well,
Thank you,
I'll
Lokendra.
take your,
Professor Paul.
I will take your idea of something entirely new. We have experimented that in many countries, and you see that history is not very good. And you don't hear any proper articulation other than people's head, I have this idea, that idea. Some leaders sometimes come with this kind of ideas. Part of it is liberalism is also based on certain foundational ideas that are not there when you come up with something entirely new. We know entirely new in Iran, in North Korea, a lot of places trying to play with that. So I'm not at all comfortable with the idea of entirely new. Human history is not made out of entirely new ideas, but unless, of course, Marxism is an interesting example of fairly new idea to some extent. But it caused enormous bloodshed and no success in creating the just society that they were looking for. So why I think that liberal order, you have to look not only neoliberalism. This is a big problem with critiques, especially if you look at the neoliberal part is where really reforms are needed. The core ideas of human equality, human progress, the optimistic view of human condition, violence can be mitigated with other institutional and domestic structures. All these are very attractive, okay? Not many other systems can offer that. Whether you like it or not, that's not what we are witnessing in the so-called civilizational states of Asia Pacific today. So in a sense, it is, yeah, and your question about neocolonialism, the funding came from largely taxes. There were taxation internally. Yes, neocolonialism was happening to some extent, but there was a lot of wealth created internally because they also had technological advantages, by the way. The Europeans and the Americans had some massive technological advantages. So you needed their products, aircraft, whatnot, weapons. I am not a 100% supporter of everything America does, or you probably heard me very critical of some of their ideas. They are not that generous as you think or argue. But the liberal ideas they have abandoned for the promotion of geopolitical or other reasons, those ideals would help societies. And decolonization, by the way, was benefited from these liberal ideas, which people won't want to give them credit because they think it's Gandhi did it. Yes. But without Roosevelt and others ready to destroy the European imperial dominance, they would not have changed. They were very willing to keep the fight going on. So there is room for change within liberalism, which that's why we have to think about liberal reform, not complete destruction. Because imagine without some liberal ideas, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, economic activities, all these are needed. And I also don't think that going back to these autarkic models is not going to help anybody. I mean, there are a lot of people in India. Recently, I attended a talk in Kottayam University by a very famous Marxist leader saying, things were better before 1991. He was asserting for the poor. No evidence is given. I lived there as a student, and I know that things were not better. Things have improved, but not for everyone in the way that you really want them to improve. That's because the state hasn't come up with ideas to change the welfare aspect of it. And so state capacity is needed. So my question to him actually was a very interesting one. It said, the same bureaucracy, if you go back to that model, will be running the Indian system. If they are not developmental, what is the guarantee they will bring any prosperity, a change to the system? They run it for their own purposes. So he didn't have an answer. He thought it was not relevant here. Somehow changing the system will change the world. Anyway, I think your questions are big and some are a little ideological, but I do believe that liberalism, probably elements of it is needed, but not 100% adaptation or exactly what it is going on. And with understanding that there are big problems in liberalism. But if liberal failure will be a catastrophic one, if the Chinese model or other models emerge with identity politics as the leading ideas behind them.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Are there any other questions to Professor Paul? Let me have the last question to you then, Professor Paul, that you made a very interesting observation in terms of the elections in the US and said, that you use the word punishing when compared to when you're referring to the last US elections. Now, if we have to take the US election and the latest election in Canada and also in Germany, was that really punishing that in the sense, did Biden get that kind of a overarching support, or did Trump lose that badly? It was a tough fight, wasn't it, Paul? So
the argument I was making was that that's the liberal assumption, that if you don't follow prudent policies, the electorate would. And that assumption proved to be wrong in some of these elections you mentioned. Partly because of if you don't create distributional, if you don't face the distributional challenges, you generate a segment of the electorate willing to hurt this idea and then believe in these reckless leaders to some extent. So this is not to say that that's how always happens, but they hold that assumption. That's the idea of liberal superiority or democratic superiority, because you can throw away those ruthless leaders through the ballot box without bullets. And so this assumption is held. I am not saying that's exactly what is happening. And that is not happening because they cannot ignore the distributional challenges and then say that people are going to be always smart. People are not smart when it comes to cognitive distortions take place. As we know that people tend to believe things coming out of their images, their stereotyped images, as well as their understanding of the reality. And that propagandists and people with oratory skills could change especially the uneducated and not so educated, the American middle class or lower middle class in the Midwest and all, not necessarily college educated even. So liberal education is a big part of liberal success, by the way. That's why liberal arts colleges still exist. If everybody, the big problem in Indian education, everybody wants to become engineers and doctors and all, without some liberal component to that educational system, this has been losing out. In fact, the liberal arts model is in deep trouble, although a lot of students want to take it because everybody wants to get a job and somehow they will prosper. I think the danger of absence of a liberal education is that liberalism has to be educated. It's not something you are born with. People are born with, by the way, nice. When you're born, we are all very good, but you're socialized. How you're socialized matters a lot. That's why the liberal ideas have to be part of the educational curriculum. And that was missing. There's a lot of these orthodoxies came in, and liberals themselves had to be blamed for that. They need a pushback of better educating some things liberals can offer, and also self-reflection, telling that some things liberals have done badly, and that needs to be adopted in their quest for continued existence or relevance.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. The last 75 minutes was a fascinating experience on liberal order, world order, and also looking into liberalism and its status. Thank you so much for spending the last 75 minutes. I understand it's early there for you. We are hoping that sometime in the near future you'll be able to visit us. Last time we missed you. I missed you when you came to Bangalore. I'm hoping to make it up when you visit next time. You said April 2022. Our request, kindly spend some time with the partner institutions and our network. We'll be very happy to host you for a series of lectures when you are here. Thanks again, Professor Paul. Now I'll request Lokendra to formally propose a vote of thanks to you on behalf of the institutions. Lokendra, over to you.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of 10 institutions in South India, namely Christ deemed to be University, Goa University, Jain deemed to be University, Kristu Jayanti College, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Pondicherry University, Stella Maris College, St. Joseph's College, and University of Mysore, I would like to thank Professor T.V. Paul for delivering such an insightful lecture on the liberal international order. The lecture could not have been more timely as we find liberalism in deep crisis today globally. We hope that you would stay in touch with our network and enrich our scholarly endeavors through your valuable contributions. Thank you so much, Professor Paul.